So the first part of our discussion on movement disorders is to look and define 5 of the main movement disorders. Now, the first chart that I have for you is looking at disorders based on symptoms here. And I liked this as a summary so that you can recognize that the actual disorders that we're going to look at are a little bit hard to define sometimes or categorize. And so when we think about these different issues with movement, recognizing that the disorders that are associated with them may not be the full expression of just one movement issue. So when we look at this, the 5 disorders that we're going to be defining are Huntington's disease, Parkinson's disease, and then we're also going to look at the larger body of dystonias and essential tremor. So that's 4 of them. And then I've added in Tourette syndrome in addition because it's an interesting one and is a little bit outside of what you normally see here. And when we think about our 5 movement disorders, what we're going to do first is define them, and then we're going to think about how you're going to treat them. And I think it's really important when we're talking about some of the genetic-based disorders like Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease. It's just like what we talked about with Alzheimer's, where it's really hard to find a cure for these things because the root cause of it in many of these is neuronal cell death in specific areas of the brain. And how do you stop that from happening? How do you prevent that from happening? And how do you recover after you've already had that neuronal cell loss? And that's the biggest challenge. So what we'll see in the treatments is that we're really just mitigating or moderating the symptoms of these disorders. So, and starting off with our definition, when you look up here at Huntington's disease, you'll see that it is an issue in the basal ganglia, which is a collection of different regions in the brain that are all interconnected to help control movement. And when there's disruption in that, then you get in, for Huntington's disease, this athetosis, which is a slow writhing movement, and you get chorea, which is sudden, jerky, purposeless movements. So if you want specifically to write that down, in Huntington's disease, neuronal loss in a specific area of the basal ganglia, which is known as the striatum. Also cell loss in the cortex, and that's what leads to the athetosis, slow writhing movements, and chorea, sudden jerky movements. And just so you know, if at any time I go too fast, you're always welcome to pause. So if you need to pause now, you can, but I'll go ahead and move on. The other one that is the known genetic disorder is Parkinson's disease, and that is going to lead to that resting tremor or uncontrolled movement of distal appendages, so arms and legs, but most noticeably in the hands. But when individuals move with intention, the tremor goes away. So it's just that resting tremor when the neural circuitry is not active with intention, then the tremor comes back. And that is specific cell loss in an area of the basal ganglia, but different than Huntington's disease, where in Parkinson's, it's a loss of neurons in the substantia nigra. And those neurons in the substantia nigra specifically release dopamine. So you're losing dopamine neurons, which is why you can sometimes see that the extrapyramidal side effects or symptoms that we saw in schizophrenia treatment is when you inhibit dopamine, you get a little bit of that resting tremor. This is damage to neurons there and neuronal cell loss in a specific area that you get decrease in dopamine, and that's when you get that resting tremor. And moving on to dystonias. So there are many different specific dystonias. So it's a diverse movement disorder, but the main thing with these movement disorders are involuntary muscle contractions, often the agonist and antagonist muscles. So not like we talked about where an agonist increases activity of a neurotransmitter and antagonist decreased it. But if you think about an agonist doing one movement, you have an antagonist muscle that's going to do the opposite movement. So if you think of like your biceps and triceps, if those are acting at the same time, then you're going to have movement issues. And that's why you get the twisting and repetitive movements or abnormal posture. And one of the things with dystonia is it's one of the least understood movement disorders. We know that it's likely some kind of dysfunction in the basal ganglia, but the different types of dystonia indicate that there are different root causes for many of the different types of dystonias. It's not all just one thing that we know that we can go in there and fix. And Tourette's syndrome, which is very complex, is thought to result from different interactions between social, environmental factors, and multiple genetic variations. So it's like how autism has many different genetic bases, right? So, and it's pretty unique. And I don't want to say unique to every individual, but there are a lot of different possible genetic variations that are going to cause things like autism and Tourette syndrome. So to target one thing specifically is very challenging because it is probably depends on each individual and what their specific genetic variation is. But one thing that we do think for Tourette syndrome is that it is likely a disturbance of going from the cortex to the striatum, which is part of the basal ganglia, to the thalamus, and back to the cortex. So there's this feedback loop. And when that works properly, we don't have random verbal outbursts. But when there's a disturbance there's this disinhibition. So a lack of inhibition of the motor and the emotional or the limbic system. And one thing that is theorized is that it's increased dopamine at different times. So either dopamine tonic, which means like more regular, and phasic, when it means increases in phases and then goes down. And in that individual's ability to express and learn tics. So it's a circuit issue and is often associated with ADHD and OCD. And I want to show you briefly so that you can visualize the circuitry. And you can see that if you're going from this one to this one to this one to this one, right, that's 4 different places where the disruption could be. So in order to figure out like where that actually is, it could be different in each individual. And I like this image because I think it gives you a good visual of what we're talking about when we say the basal ganglia. So in this outside part, so here's the outside of the brain. So here's the temporal lobe. Here is in this part, I'm not sure if it's the frontal cortex or the parietal lobe based on the sectioning, but basically you have these darker brown or tan is your cortex. These lighter parts are the axons moving through. And then you can see that deeper in the brain, you have these yellow and blue kind of candy corn shapes, right? So these are part of the striatum, which is the putamen, the globus pallidus, and the caudate. You don't need to memorize all those. You just need to recognize that this is a network of nuclei or collection of cell bodies that are going to regulate the control of movement. And you can see that it's a network, which means that if something's going wrong here, then there's going to be issues with the whole processing. And so for Tourette syndrome, we think that the issue is in this feedback system from the cortex to areas of the basal ganglia that then feed back to, either in a direct pathway or an indirect pathway, to the thalamus, which then feeds back to the cortex. And so if you disrupt that, then you don't get that behavioral inhibition or that movement inhibition, and you get overexpression of whatever tic is being expressed in that individual's Tourette or experience of Tourette syndrome. And then I think they summarize it really nicely here. So this cortex to the basal ganglia, which is all these blue and yellow colors, to the thalamus, back to the cortex. That feedback loop that helps control those behaviors. And then the last of the 5 is essential tremor. And we think that that is caused by issues in regions of the cerebellum and the brainstem, probably due to dysfunction of GABA signaling and neurodegeneration in the cerebellar dentate nucleus and the brainstem. And this is often has genetic causes. And what it leads to is what we call tremulous activity, or just a tremor in the extremities, so the arms or the legs. And thought to be a cause or caused by from the cerebellum to the thalamus to the cortex. And I think this image really hits hard in terms of recognizing where the causes of essential tremor can come from. So this was in an article that was published that was looking at many different causes for essential tremor, and they have evidence from multiple avenues. But what you can see, so here is the cerebellum, and so there are lots of different regions that can be seen, or deficits can be seen in individuals with essential tremor. But it's not just the cerebellum, right? It could be the brainstem and could be areas in the cortex that are likely contributing to that essential tremor. And so it's very hard to diagnose, like where in an individual, where it's going to be. And if you are going to work to treat that, it's hard to target that specific region. So that's one thing you'll notice in many of the treatments, is that we're using the same things for most of the movement disorders. And all that we're doing is just helping make the symptoms not as bad. And so now we can move on to the actual treatment of these things. And we'll walk through those in the next video.